So, good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Kim Collins, and I'm pleased to be able to welcome you all to our Lunch and Learn today that's hosted by the African American Employee Resource Group. I am MnDOT's Deputy Commissioner and Chief Administrative Officer. And while my name appears as Dawn, believe me, I go by my middle name of Kim, but I promise I'll answer to either one. So that will work. I am also a member of the AAERG group. So today I will be co-facilitating this event along with my colleague Jesse Johnson, and he is the AAERG chair. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jesse so he can introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. So I'm Jesse Johnson. I chair MnDOT's African American Employee Resource Group. And I just want to welcome everyone to this presentation and express our excitement to have all of you join us for this Lunch and Learn celebrating Black History Month and hearing from our panelists today. As part of its business activities related to ERG events, MnDOT's African American Employee Resource Group will record this presentation for viewing by any party interested in this event with access to MnDOT's internal and external websites and YouTube. If you've enabled your camera during this session, the recording may include your image, which is private data under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. You are not required to allow MnDOT to use your image, and there are no consequences for declining to do so. To opt out of the recording, simply turn off your camera. The recording will be accessible to anyone with access to MnDOT's internal and external websites and YouTube, or anyone authorized by law. And again, just a friendly reminder to please keep your mic on mute during our discussion today. If you do have a question, though, please feel free to put that in the chat today, and we'll try to answer those questions later after we've asked a few questions of our own. And with that, we'll start off by introducing our panelists today.
So today's panel discussion features professionals at departments of transportation from different parts of the country. They are all working to create cultures of inclusion at their respective agencies. Our first speaker is Nicole Tyler, who is the Director of Equitable Transportation for the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, or PennDOT. In her newly created role, Nicole is responsible for developing and leading department-wide strategy and framework for instituting a culture of inclusion and creating equitable transportation systems within communities. Her most recent accomplishment involved creating and implementing a Commonwealth-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion training initiative. The successful implementation of the DEI curriculum introduced employees from all walks of life to highly sensitive topics that generated meaningful conversations around race, implicit bias, microaggressions. Did someone just unmute themselves?
I think we did, but I think you're safe to keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going. Microaggressions, inclusive leadership, and other areas designed to bring about positive change and a shift to more inclusive workplace. As PennDOT's equity and inclusion leader, Nicole is passionate about using her voice and human-centered approach to help employees value each other because of, not in spite of, their differences. Nicole holds a BS in Communications and Spanish from Towson University, a Master of Arts degree in Human Resource Management from Notre Dame of Maryland University, and a training certificate in Diversity and Inclusion. Nicole and her husband are the proud parents of a son and currently reside in York, Pennsylvania.
And I'll go ahead and I'll introduce our second speaker, who's Marcia Nelson. She is the Chief Equity Officer for the Colorado Department of Transportation, also known as CDOT, and leads the department's newly created Equity and Environmental Justice branch. She previously worked at the Denver Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, where she led the department's priorities in transportation equity and the development, execution, and prioritization of multiple high-priority special projects and initiatives, including internal and external stakeholder relations. Before that, Marcia held multiple roles with M.A. Mortensen Company's Denver operating group, most notably as chief spokesperson and lead change agent in corporate compliance and social responsibility initiatives. In both her public and private sector roles, she led and championed community and small business engagement, building economic equity for SMW DBE businesses, which that's a very long acronym. I'm not sure what that means, but I think it's connected to our DBE program, probably maybe at MnDOT. Advancing career growth and opportunities for underrepresented industry professionals, and eradicating opportunity gaps for students and young professionals through exposure to industry-related professional and trade skilled jobs. She also currently serves on the Aurora Public Schools Foundation Board, the University of Colorado Denver's College of Engineering Industry Advisory Board, and is president of the Colorado chapter of the Conference of Minority Transportation Officials, also known as COMTO. Marcia is a thoughtful, decisive, collaborative, and results-driven leader that leads by convening diverse perspectives to weave together the collective. She leans in to ensure all voices are welcome and heard. And then we have our final speaker here, Amar, and Deputy Commissioner Collins will introduce her as well. Oh.
Okay, so our third panelist is Amar. And Amar, I'm going to respectfully take a stab at your name, and I hope I say it correctly. So you'll have to forgive me if I don't. But Amar Asusena Sid. Yay. There you go. Practice makes perfect. Amar Sid values and utilizes her lived and learned experiences rooted in racial justice, the environment, and the community's ability to thrive to inform her professional work. She has over 15 years of transportation and community planning and policy experience across public and nonprofit sectors, including positions in affordable housing, federal surveying, youth and health advocacy, legislative analysis, and transportation planning. Amar led the country's first state DOT office on race and equity at Caltrans, also known as CORE. Under her leadership and through meaningful collaboration, she advanced internal and external DEI efforts with a people-centered model. Before managing CORE, she was an integral statewide strategist in public transportation, including implementing and cultivating the $100 million annual California Climate Investment Low Carbon Transit Operations Program. Recently, Amar accepted the position of Deputy Director of Community Investments at the Strategic Growth Council, an office of the California Governor. And Jesse Terry has joined us. So why don't we welcome Terry, and you can make it that introduction as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Terry, for joining us. Our last speaker today is Terry Slaughter. She is the Chief Culture, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Michigan DOT, also known as MnDOT. Terry came to MnDOT from the Youth Development, Education, and Retention Strategy Group, where she was the founder and principal. She previously served as the Chief Diversity Officer at Madonna University in Livonia, Michigan, where she was responsible for all divisional performance management, strategic and operational planning, and oversaw the development of the management team and other staff. In her role at MnDOT, Terry supervises leadership for the Bureau of Transportation Planning, Office of Business Development, Office of Economic Development, Office of Organizational Development, MnDOT's Department of Equity and Inclusion Officer, and Equal Employment Opportunity Officer. In addition, Terry serves on the AASHTO, MASTO, and TRB equity committees. Terry holds a master's degree in Student Affairs Administration and a bachelor's degree in English, both from Michigan State University. She also is certified in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Workplace from the University of South Florida Muma College of Business. And that's a lot. And we've introduced all of our speakers today. And I think we'll begin by asking our first question. And I know we sent these to our panelists ahead of time, so they had some time to prepare. But again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post those in the chat, and we'll do what we can to get to those questions later in our program today. And again, this question, I think, for the most part, this is for any of our panelists to answer. Feel free to not answer if you really don't want to, but our first question is, because we're in Black History Month, how does the history of African Americans in your state influence DEI programs?
So I'm happy to jump in here, and I'm also really privileged and proud to have been invited to be a part of this panel. These are some great folks. For those of you that have joined us and haven't had the chance to meet these individuals, they are great and they're doing really wonderful work for various places across the country. So I'm glad to be among them this afternoon. So here in Michigan, Black history is integrally tied to our transportation network and its planning. Especially now with the bipartisan infrastructure law, trying to really get a sense of how communities of color are situated within our state. Of course, those of you can easily recognize Michigan on the map. We are a state that consists of two peninsulas, one northern, one southern. We have some broad rural spaces, as well as a number of important and large urban spaces, and just about everywhere in between. And so how our African American community migrated from the South and came into our urban centers, and how, frankly, in many instances, they've been less included in some of our rural spaces, absolutely impacts on it has impacted both on our historical design of highways, roads, bridges, and the execution of our multimodal transportation around the state, and is definitely, with the bipartisan infrastructure law, critical to our planning for the future.
Hi, it's Marcia Nelson with CDOT. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here. You know, I work for M.A. Mortensen Company. Many of you may or may not be familiar with it. They're a prime contractor based in Minneapolis. And so I've been out there a couple of times. It's a beautiful state. So it's nice to reconnect again to the state and to the people there. Here in Colorado, I mean, I always call Minneapolis is where I used to visit quite often there. Very similar to Denver in terms of the demographics and the population. So it felt a lot like going home oftentimes there. So here in Colorado, you know, our percentage of African Americans here, I think, is just a little over 4%. And we're talking about the state, right? As a state, small business wise, we are 99.5% small business in our state, and yet African Americans comprise of almost 1%. I'd say maybe 1 to 2% of the businesses here in Colorado. And so you see that there is a huge gap for opportunities for the African American community. You know, in terms of our state and the migration of African Americans from the South, you know, for us here in Colorado, it happened a lot due to the gold rush. And so using the South Platte River as a means of transportation and getting to our state, establishing many communities like Deerfield, which was in the rural parts of our state. And then our popular, what we call the Harlem of the West, 5 Points. I don't know if anyone has been to 5 Points here in Denver, but they call it 5 Points because there's 5 streets that intersect there. And from the 1870s all the way to 1950s, the 50s, I believe, that's where you really see a lot of the African Americans populated there. But the unique part of 5 Points is that it's built on a runway, a one-way street. So there's one way to get in, but no way for them to get out. So there's a lot of history around our African Americans here. And I think the settlement of African American farmers, of gold miners, really, you know, and families looking to just start a new life in the Midwest or West, you know, we've set, we as a community have really made a presence here. A lot of people always joke and say, are there really Black people in Colorado? Yes, yes. And we actually do ski. We do a lot of skiing and snowboarding out here. And so how can, as a state agency or as a state, we support the African Americans that currently live here, the Africans that do move here? Because I think the last thing I read too, Colorado is, if not the leader, we are one of the leading states where a lot of African immigrants and migrants are coming to our state. And so right now you see a big influx of them, and how can we get them as a part of our workforce and a part of our living society here in Colorado is a big effort that we're doing here right now.
Yeah, thank you, Marcia. And Terry, I saw your hand up. Did you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I did want to add to it, because I thought of something as Marcia was talking, and I mentioned the African American migrations from the South, which of course make us think about the early and mid 20th century. But even before that, when we think about where Michigan is, we're right across the Detroit River from Canaan land, basically. So for enslaved African Americans, this was a place to try to get to, because you wanted to try and make your way to freedom. And so if you go down onto the Detroit River, there is a memorial for enslaved folks who were really looking to Canada as a place of freedom and respite and deliverance. And so that's another way that African American history plays into the transportation conversation within Michigan, is that, we've continued for, not just some social reasons in terms of where we are as a state and how close we are to Canada. We've also continued to build out those relationships with the auto industry, with forestry, and with other parts of the industry that have provided jobs. But there's a rich cultural history there that still creates how we build our transportation relative to our bridges and how people get back and forth to family members that may be on the other side of the border, jobs that may be on the other side of the border, and so forth.
I can add from Caltrans, and I'm just prefacing I'm no longer with Caltrans, but still connected through the transportation system from my new job. But how we actually formed the Caltrans Office of Race and Equity was years of historical deep dive and sharing out with the rest of the department, and really kind of bringing to light the history of our transportation systems, specifically how our highway system in California really followed the red line track and kind of moved through predominantly Black communities, both in the Los Angeles area, Oakland area, Sacramento area, and even down through Central Valley, where a lot of folks really don't think there's a large Black population. And so kind of bringing that to light was a aha moment for a lot of folks, where people were like, I had no idea, where I think myself and the rest of our team were saying this history is now, this history is present and it's available. So that really kind of started to change the narrative of our DEI construct, of really getting it back to a place of history, because people talked about the history of our rail systems, about movements in this country, but failed to actually daylight what it meant to have communities thrive when other communities were specifically bulldozed over, people left out. So that really has shaped the D&I discussion within the department, specifically being able to talk about race, was talking about how race has been impacted, and specifically Black and Indigenous populations within the state. One thing that I think in this kind of daylight was really highlighting stories of communities that were really, I would say, razored out, and tracking families that lost everything by having to be displaced multiple times by multiple freeways coming in, right? And it kind of followed the trajectory of, in my brain, the genocide of Indigenous communities, where you're saying, we need this land, we are going to move you out. And so that's what happened here in California, where our highway system, found land. We're putting the highway system, moved people out, gave them some vouchers or gave them some land elsewhere. 10 years later, same thing happening in other kind of now desirable communities, and it's still happening to this day. So bringing that to light was, I think, pivotal for a lot of folks that really could not understand why we were even talking about race and equity within transportation. And it kind of gave people a little bit more understanding of, okay, this is still happening. And I think when we think about migration patterns, Terry, you talked about people coming up to Michigan. From Michigan, people came to California. They were settling in East Oakland. They were settling in Richmond. And that, again, not by design or by structure of their own will. It was really, these are the only places that you can actually live. A lot of people came to California to be part of, in Northern California, the port system through different types of kind of jobs. However, they were not allowed to kind of live anywhere. So when you think about where people were settling, East Oakland and Richmond were right next to very hazardous kind of dumping spaces, are kind of like Chevron factories in Richmond. Those were the only places that you could actually lease land and then eventually procure land. So they became segregated communities. Those areas today are still really plagued as disadvantaged communities per CalEnviroScreen, which labels, high environmental hazards, right? So we're still seeing the kind of ways where people are only allowed to live, and then how our freeway system really, I would say, uplifts that tragedy of kind of positioning people and giving them only certain allotments, if you will. I wanted to say one thing that when I was working in the transit area specifically, I started thinking about the railroad system and who built the railroad system. And it's largely kind of talked about Chinese immigrants in California. There's a lot of Chinese encampments, Chinatowns, if you will, especially in our rural communities. But I think also gets missed is the African-American labor in building the railroad system, specifically in California, and keeping that movement of goods and infrastructure going. And one thing, if you haven't heard, there's a community down in Central Valley. It's in Tulare County. It's called Allensworth. In 1908, part of this kind of dream of moving out and getting people out of the South or out of Michigan was, we have now an opportunity to procure a large space of land following the railroad system and creating our own African-American town. So Allensworth created their own town, had their own goods, was the first African-American school district in California. But what plagued that community was the railroad system, right? They were situated in really lush farmland. The railroad system saw thriving community, saw, people kind of having their own space. The railroad system, which many of these communities worked in, actually moved out of Allensworth, and then really messed up how people moved their goods within Allensworth. And then within 4 years of moving that rail line, specifically moving that rail line, that community left. And so it's just kind of another space to think about histories and what that reflects on community and how it kind of shapes our society, that it's not just in the history. This is how we live today, thinking that communities weren't thriving back in the day or didn't have the ability to thrive. It was specific strategic efforts to disallow communities to have what a lot of other white communities in particularly had. So those kind of histories, I think, are pivotal when we can even really want to scratch the surface of talking about DE&I in a transportation space.
And just to add to that as well, Pennsylvania is home to over 1.4 million African Americans. And throughout history, many have played a significant role in Pennsylvania's economic, or spiritual, cultural, and political development. And like many others have shared in your respective states, I want to hone in on Philadelphia, because Philadelphia, there's a lot of rich history about the African American experience in Philadelphia. And back in the 1800s and into the 20th century, many African Americans escaped racism and poverty in the Jim Crow South, because there were so many opportunities at that time in Philadelphia. And so they were drawn to Philadelphia by the hope of receiving work and establishing an African American community where they felt safe and psychologically safe to live and to raise their families. Unfortunately, although the work was there, racial discrimination in education and hiring practices limited the types of work that was open to most African Americans in Philly at that time. Just like we see today, unfortunately, they were typically relegated to low paid, hard labor and service jobs. And unfortunately, that hindered the success of many African Americans, unfortunately. Also, segregation, racial segregation was still very much prominent in Philadelphia. And I wanted to share that because you hear a trend in all of the states that are represented on this call today, because it has really shaped our state's DEI program, so much so that our former administration created an Office of Advocacy and Reform. And within that office, we have our DEI director for the Commonwealth, our DEI educator, if you will, director of education. And what I'm noticing in Pennsylvania is that we are really starting to be open and be real about discussing race and racism, which is something that I hadn't seen in the 15 years that I've been living in Pennsylvania. I'm originally from Maryland, by the way, but we are really having those difficult but necessary conversations around race and racism, and productive conversations, so much so that we initiated an anti-racism book club that's open up to all Commonwealth employees. Organically, we've created what we call a human-centered community within the Commonwealth. And it's similar, I would say it's similar to an employee resource group, if you will, but we call it our human-centered community. And I'm so excited about these initiatives because I am seeing such a diverse group of employees throughout the Commonwealth coming together, Black, white, brown, Asian, you name it, just organically coming together, discussing race. All of the difficult, the sensitive subjects, they're hungry for knowledge and really want to learn. And so I'm seeing a shift, and I'm hoping that this will continue. But the reality is, despite our gains, there are still disparities among our African American employees in terms of the type of jobs that they're in, lower level, the contracting opportunities, and much, much more. So I know we'll get into some of that a little later, but I wanted to share that, what's going on in Pennsylvania.
Well, thank you all for sharing. I think we've heard a wide array of different perspectives already on different approaches, and really touching on some of the challenges that you have. And I know we might get to a question that talks a little bit more about those challenges, but I want to pass it on to Kim for our next question here.
So, Nicole, I think that your answer just was a really nice segue to this next question that really takes a look at how it is that experiences of African Americans now involved in transportation are influencing the activities that are happening within your agency that are geared to really address inclusion. So kind of the intro for this question is really looking at that background of the modern civil rights movement. And many view it as having set the foundation for what we see today as diversity and equity programs. And so as we are now seeing more African Americans in the workplace, how do you feel that their presence, that our presence in the workplace is impacting your agency's activities?
So, one of the things that I'm kind of on the fence in some ways with the conversation about presence in the workforce, because if I'm honest and I really look at Michigan's numbers, we are in a place where we'd love to see our numbers better than they are. And that looking strictly at the numbers and our African American level of engagement in roles within the DOT, looking strictly at those numbers, I could make a strong argument that we've lost ground. But I think what we offer and what roles like the ones that the people that you see on this panel and Marsha so wonderfully referred to us as equiteers at one point. I just absolutely adore that term. What so many equiteers across the nation are working to do is to connect these conversations about transportation to history and the big whys. Why is this an important part of the conversation? So when we look at the civil rights movement, I recently had the privilege while we were at the Transportation Research Board conference in Washington, D.C., to take a group of folks from our DOT, as well as some consultants that work very closely with us, to the National Museum of African American History. And we all took a picture. It's a fabulous museum. Please, if you can get there, go and plan to spend a day. We were able to take a picture in front of a photo of Rosa Parks. It is so critically important for us to centrally locate transportation in the conversation about civil rights and the civil rights movement and our current social movements like Black Lives Matter, if nothing else, because many of the most important, most seminal moments in those struggles took place in what we would call our right of way on transit. So the Montgomery bus boycott is about we're involved in a transit system and in a society that doesn't treat us fairly. And we want something better. Rosa Parks decided to stand up on that bus that day to say, I have had enough. The murder of George Floyd took place in the right of way, as did Ahmaud Arbery, as did Tyree Nichols. So these are important conversations to have because even if we don't address some of the social issues that we must address now, I would argue, frequently we are the stage for the things that happen. And so we bear a strong influence in the conversation. We have to show up and say, hey, enough of this. What we provide is supposed to be about equal access. It's supposed to be about economic development for all of the citizens in our state. It's supposed to be about getting people to the health care that they need and to education. It should not be about this. And so to me, that's one of the big whys that we are trying to establish as we address things like the updating of our strategic plan. What role does our infrastructure play in our history and in what's happening today?
Yeah, I'm going to chime in there, and I fully agree with what Terry was saying. I'll be honest, I kind of struggled with this question. I'm like, what exactly are they looking for in this question? And it makes me think of two things. When we say the African-American experience and its influence in transportation, I think historically, you look at African-Americans and really all minorities have had and should have influence on transportation decisions, but have not, right? But then when you look at it from a lens of like internal to our agency, I don't think we have enough perspective internally to, I think we're at the cusp of beginning that, but we don't have enough of that presence within the industry itself, right? For an example, here in Colorado, to my knowledge, I am the only African-American on our executive management team. And so I've become this voice for many different minority groups to ensure that we are truly at the table. And in this role, it is my responsibility, and I believe it genuinely is. I am in a position where I have to ensure that my voice is constantly heard. My voice makes many people uncomfortable, but that's okay because that is my job. And so as an African American, as a biracial female in this white male dominated industry, you know, it's a tough position to be in. But thankfully, there are a lot of staff that I have at CDOT that are supportive. And I make sure that African American staff members, whether they're on my team or outside of my team or in the regions across my agency, they all know I have an open door policy for everyone in the agency, but especially for those of us who typically our voices aren't heard, right? And that includes the community. But I think in terms of influence in transportation, you know, as African Americans, we have no choice but to be innovative, right? People always talk about a need for innovation and new ideas in an organization, whether it be private or public. And I believe as African Americans, we are probably the most innovative people. And so why are we therefore not at the table? So my role I see as bringing us more to the table, but not just that, it's ensuring that our voices are heard. And if you are part of an organization, I would encourage you to always use your voice and know that it is powerful. And if your leadership is not supporting that, then something needs to be said, right? So that would be my piece in terms of experience. I think we have plenty of it, but we need more. You know, here at Colorado, that's one of my passions. I've created, or I am on the cusp of creating, but I call it a career to cradle program. Workforce development is so huge to me. It's so important. And so from literally the age of kindergarten all the way through college or trade, right? Because we have options in this industry. You can go the collegiate route or the trade route. And so one of my pillars within my branch, which will be the workforce development branch, I've created a cradle to career. So as crazy as it sounds to most people, starting in kindergarten, many of our students, our African-American students, if they are not reading at third grade level, they are dropping out of high school. And we have a high percentage of our students dropping out of high school because they cannot read. And so that is the start of how we begin to expose, educate, and empower our young people, African Americans, into this industry to really begin to influence the industry as a whole, planning all of these roads and highways, our communities and our cities.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I do want to just mention, I think we may be getting feedback from you, Marsha. I'm not sure. I'm going to actually, just for the sake of doing this, I'm just going to mute everyone and then I'll unmute again. So you should be able to do that. Just give me a second here. I think we're actually okay. Anyway, we're gonna keep going, and I'll ask our next question. And I know it's one that I had sent to you a little bit later, but I think it's important because of where we are in the discussion. And there are some that may not see the value of DEI programs, and in some cases, they actively try to eliminate the DEI programs altogether. As DEI professionals, how do you navigate this type of challenge? And what are ways that we can continue to make progress?
Yeah. I think one of, go ahead.
Go ahead, Terry.
Please. Now, I was going to say, I think one of the things that really helps me in this conversation is, and I remember saying this to my colleagues in my interview. And when I say interview, what I mean is the 50 interviews that MnDOT put me through. But it was wonderful. I got to learn to know a number of people within the team. But what I said was, in my work life, which has much of it has been around diversity, equity, and inclusion, I stopped doing DEI, if you will, for the sake of the moral imperative, probably 20 or 30 years ago. when I first was a real baby in the field. And a part of it was because what it's about is the data. Okay. Our data is telling us a story about whether or not people are being equitably included in our economies, in our schools, to Marsha's point, if people are getting the health care that they need, if people are having the same amounts of safety as they travel to and fro. Our data is telling us a story. And what we can have as a purple conversation, that is both a red and a blue conversation, if a part of what comes into play in the conversation is politics, is there's a great argument for why diversity and inclusion just makes good old-fashioned economic sense. Because when we continue to keep people outside of our economies, our tax bases are lower. We don't have the skilled workforce that we need. We've got people, again, on the sidelines that we very much need to have in the game. And so when people will kind of fly the flag of no, this diversity, equity, inclusion stuff, it really doesn't matter anymore, so and so and so forth. Let's pull out the data. Let's look at these census tracts, and you tell me if it doesn't matter anymore. And then tell me the story. If now you will continue to hold that, oh, this doesn't matter, on the off chance that it did matter in 20 years from now, we are in a much more difficult position than we are today. How are you going to tell that story? And so, that's what I always push into is, what does our data say?
Yeah, thank you, Terry. Do y'all still hear feedback when I'm talking? Am I?
I think we're okay.
Okay, I'm sorry about that, y'all.
No, that's okay.
I tried to do that. But so here's, okay, how do you deal with those who may not agree or see the value? That's a tough one because there's a lot out there, right? And so I always attested to just learning the language. I think as a DE, well, let me say this. I prefer to use the term EDI, and I'll explain why. You hear it in many different ways. I prefer to use the term equity first. There's a lot of push to say diversity and inclusion and focus on DEI. And that is important, absolutely, right? Those are the goals, to be diverse and to be inclusive in our organizations, private or public sector. But if our organization is not built to be equitable, if the culture is not there, then you begin to lose those diverse staff, ideas, thoughts, processes, policies, etc., right? Which creates things to be inclusive. So I always say EDI first, because equity, Marsha's personal hat on first, equity is important because you're building the foundation of what that means for the organization and how your organization, I call staff members, you're walking billboards. I need you all to be walking billboards of what it means to be equitable and market that both internally and externally. Because when you focus on equity, D&I, the diversity and inclusion, it happens organically. You literally almost don't have to do anything about it. It happens naturally. And so that's why I prefer to say EDI. So you may hear me say that. In terms of, I work a lot with our engineers. I guess you would call me the external side of things, although I do both the internal and external EDI. Coming on a year ago, I learned that sometimes those are siloed. Well, I fought against that very much, because although I understand how they may work separately, there is a natural intersection and they have to work together. And so here in Colorado, although we were intentionally designed where my branch only focused on the external, so project delivery, working with engineers and contractors, et cetera, the internal side was housed in HR. Our EJE branch, Equity Environmental Justice branch, now houses all of it, the internal and external. So my role has expanded. So I am looking to even grow a little bit more with our staff and even with my budget, because we all know as EDI professionals, we don't always get the budget that we need. But, you know, one of the things that we're doing here in Colorado, you know, on a personal level, I try to ensure that I'm listening to the other perspective, right? Even if I may not agree with it, it's very important to give that person or individual grace to learn their perspective, because, hey, I might be missing something myself. And then, you know, allow them the opportunity to just be heard. And then from there, I've been very successful in being able to share my perspective or the perspective of others. And what's worked for me is making the connection, speaking the language of that particular individual. So making a personal connection or a professional connection to help them see through that lens and making it a much stronger lens for them to see more equitably. As an organization here at CDOT, one of the things that I and my team have done is we've looked at our Title VI program. And I've always preached to my team here and my agency as a whole. And many of you are I'm sure know on the call, if you only focus on compliance, then you haven't begun to touch equity, right? And our Title VI program, many of our programs here in DOTs focus on compliance. We have to be compliant in the work that we do. But in our Title VI program, we've done a unique and innovative thing where we have actually embedded equity efforts. And so the two absolutely go hand in hand. And so we designed it where that we are actually following the project life cycle. And so we literally go one phase to the next to ensure that all of our Title VI programs and processes are looked at through an equity lens by combining them through our Title VI program. Because at the end of the day, your Title VI compliance can't go away, right? We all know that. And so making sure that those two go hand in hand is our way of really showing and ensuring that it stays as a part of the culture and our policies and whatnot. This year, particular year, we are working, I am working on building an equity policy as well as procedural directives for our agency to ensure that's another way to ensure that things are practiced within our organization. So. Engineers like to follow things by the rule. I know. I went to engineering school. I know very well how our engineers are and I get it, very structured. And so it's that unique way of understanding how we work together in this effort.
Yeah, that's a good point too, and also especially touching on how you're integrating a lot of this work in the actual processes that already exist, as opposed to creating something new that may or may not fit within the processes or the systems already in place. So I appreciate your perspective on that. And I also want to ask again the same question for Nicole and Amar, if they would also like to answer that.
Sure, and similar to Marcia, I too I lead with equity as well. I call ours equity, inclusion, and belonging, so EIB. So sort of interchange the acronym a little bit. But one thing I want to highlight, for me, I find what works well where I am, the seat that I am in Pennsylvania, is really leading with empathy. And it's important because I've been in this role for just a little over a year. And Pennsylvania is working very hard to diversify our workforce at PennDOT. We've made some strides, but we still have a very long way to go in terms of diversifying our workforce. So in the seat that I sit in, just to be very candid with you, my first week here, the only person who I saw who looked remotely close to me for my first 3 months, I should say, was our custodial worker on my entire floor. And so being the only African American on our executive leadership team, I'm seeing this and I'm looking at all the other floors, the different levels that we have, and I really didn't see many people of color, to be quite honest. It really motivated me even more to lead with empathy. And when I say that is traditionally in the DEI world, when employees hear we're going to have a DEI initiative or a DEI program, if you will, it automatically equates to, oh, that's just for Black and brown people. And if we are truly focused and really serious about being inclusive, and Marsha, you touched on this a little bit, it's really important to really center and hear all perspectives and voices and to try to bring everyone along on this journey. And so for me, when I say I'm leading, I'm trying to lead by empathy. I am really trying to work hard at the listening of all employees, listening to employees' pain points, because there's a perceived threat that I notice from our non-African American employees. There is a threat. Whenever you don't have a solid understanding of what true diversity and inclusion is, there's that threat of the fear of unknown. There's denial. We've already been down this road before. We've done this in the past. There's also a threat to someone's social identity, their individual identity. And so there's so many unknowns there, and automatically there's a pushback. Why do we have to do this? We've already had unconscious bias training. Why do we have to do this? We already hired you. And so there is a real threat there. And I try very early on when I had some meet and greet sessions to meet people where they are and to really just lay out what all of the threats are, as uncomfortable as it is in a male, white, middle-aged, male-dominated field. Imagine me, I'm 5'1", the only petite, if you will, Black woman in a room of 30 to 50 white males, maybe 1 or 2 white females, maybe. I'm talking to maintenance workers, construction workers, central office, those both behind a desk and those aren't behind a desk. And I get this. I had to find a way to really connect with everyone, to make everyone feel a part of this journey. And an important part of that is to dispel all of the perceptions that are out there and to give people a safe and a brave space to talk about why they're against it or what their concerns are, and to really hear people. So there's a difference between us having a dialogue versus a debate. And I want us to have a dialogue, true dialogue, and let's just break down the silos. But I learned early on the way to do that is to really listen and to have empathy and to talk about being uncomfortable. And so I think a year into my role, I have been able to really build a good rapport with, quite frankly, people who did not want to have anything to do with DEI. And I think they're really beginning to understand and to see the value, and to pair that with what Terry talked about, the data. But what do you do when the data is not enough? And this is where the empathy comes into place. Now, granted, I have to be realistic. I know I'm not going to reach everybody, but it's a starting point of really allowing people to open up and say, I don't know about this DEI stuff. I don't want to talk about race at work. And to really meet them where they are and to talk about the benefits, to talk about why it's important and why it matters. And I'm starting to see a shift a little bit. I've had people come to me recently. I did a presentation and said, you know what, Nicole, to be quite honest, I wasn't interested in hearing what you had to say, but the way that you put it, the way that you presented it, I see your point now. I'm willing to be a part of this journey, but I'm learning it is a process and it's not going to happen overnight. But I'm learning even in that to be more brave in stating and being uncomfortable and sitting in my uncomfortableness to get through some of these conversations. So It's definitely a journey, but it's one worth taking.
Can I add a little bit to that? I think the question kind of touches on what everybody else has said, but I think one thing when it comes to this field is the constant threat and challenge of this work on our own person, right? I think many of us came to these spaces because we don't have degrees in equity inclusion for the most part, but we live this life, right? This is lived experience. This is seeing the inequities that have shaped us as people. And I think for me, in a personal level, I was really actually against going into a DEI field because of that. I was really having a hard time with how can we move into these spaces if there are active opposition to us? Like, what kind of harm will we be subjected to as people, predominantly women, predominantly Black women, Indigenous women, Latinx women in these spaces? And then how are we able to kind of separate that space so that we can actually be healthy people at home, right? Like, those were like very like conscious things I was thinking about. And so at Caltrans, when they were starting to work towards like a race and equity and inclusion space, I was invited into that space multiple times, and I was just challenging the folks like to know and to really think critically about how we operationalize this, right? Who will be harmed as well as we move to these spaces? Are we protecting staff enough so that it's not going to be, you know, pitting each other against each other, or you're not going to have our white dominant colleagues, male colleagues, attacking, you know, women in these spaces. Caltrans is 22,000 staff members deep. Most of that kind of workforce of African-American, brown people are in the maintenance fields, where we see huge opposition to this thought of equity and inclusion. In 2019, I was at a Lake Arrowhead conference where the whole thing was on race and equity, and it just blew up. Like, it went out of control. And it was because we had folks that were really kind of making an effort to talk about race and equity in the transportation spaces, like really thinking critical about how we use the data, how we're examining data in all classifications and all of our modes. And then we had a white elder male kind of disrupt all that space, where there was a lot of headway that had been made. And the women in the room predominantly spoke up and took that space over and said, we're not going to continue these conversations. This is not how we're going to move. We have all made some kind of great strides in these spaces to talk about and be honest about what equity means for people. And in that space, we had one person who was on a panel kind of wrapping up this conversation, ask people who were uncomfortable to raise their hands, say, hey, you know, we had 2 days of difficult conversations. Can you raise your hands on who was uncomfortable? A lot of people rose their hands, and it was predominantly white people in that space. And I'm looking around, and the colleagues that I was with, we were just kind of like, wow, like, people are looking at us like, did we make them feel uncomfortable? You know, is that what's happening here? So my direct question when they ask for audience, I say, you know, I'm personally tired of being in these spaces where we can center folks that are uncomfortable when we know we need to have these conversations. And I would like to ask those that want to raise their hand, who felt seen and heard in these spaces, who felt comfortable in these spaces, and why aren't we centering our perspectives in this conversation when we know the data continually tells us, you know, who are being arrested on our right of way, who are being harmed on our right of way, who that creativity is kind of extracted from to create the transformational spaces that we're in. Why are we not continuing to center our spaces? That pushed me into the DEI space, because I was like, you know what? F this, right? Like, I'm going to continue to challenge the process so that we're not just going to be, you know, really low level, like making changes while people will still be harmed in these spaces. And it was a difficult decision, specifically in California, and I think in Michigan as well, where we have active legislation that prohibits the kind of centering of race and equity work, right? How do we actually have a race and equity office in California if we cannot actually talk about race. And so that was one thing that kind of has challenged this space for quite some time. Workforce optics, all of the things we know we do not have the kind of breadth of our populations that we're serving. So I think what has I think created camaraderie in this space is really looking at and making connections with folks that are our allies, but also folks that are willing to you know, get in the good trouble, as people have said, with us, right? Not just the allies, but folks that are locking arms with us and actually like being able to speak up for us, right? When we're having hard time speaking up for ourselves, when we're defeated, we have colleagues that are able to step in and say, no, you know, this person actually made this comment a while ago, and I'm going to actually be the front for this so that they're not having to shoulder all that tough decision making or those challenging conversations. And I think it's really important to really validate the people that are in the room, the people that are not in the room. And I think it's also critical. I think, Marsha, you mentioned it earlier, is kind of creating a pathway for folks to actually engage in the transportation system, whereas most people in the planning practice don't understand or know planning until you're in college, and maybe it's even too late. You don't know transportation like classifications or even existence, right? I mean, those things really aren't really conversed at a young age. I think when I was in junior high, the only transportation knowledge I had was to be someone who enforced like parking tickets. And that was really glamorized in my community. It was like, you can get this great paying job by being an enforcement agent of parking, right? And it was like, why is that the only job that is discussed, you know, in our young spaces, especially in communities that are predominant for Black and Latino communities? I think one last thing to say here, I'm not Black, I'm not African American, but I have continually centered and given voice where folks have already made spaces. And I also acknowledge my privilege in this space as an Indigenous person, and then also have created spaces where, you know, because of my privilege, people will send me wild things like, you know, how can you be in this space, Samar? You know, you're not Black, you're, you know, Hispanic. Why don't you side with us? Because, you know, all of these things. And I have to say, you know, why do you assume people with different identities aren't going to be, you know, supporting the voice of others, especially those that are, you know, more burdened by our inequities in our system? And then again, let's go back to the data, because I hear it all the time from engineers. We just don't know. We don't know this information. It's there. It's there. We have safety data reports all the time. We have demographics that are showing us who are impacted. And so I continuously raise that as a, you know, the spaces that I've had privilege to be in, of creating that kind of critical dialogue. And I like to have dialogue, but I also like to be very clear that I'm not going to bend in a certain way to make other people feel comfortable anymore, especially when it comes to harming other people that we already know the data is showing us have been harmed and will continue to be harmed if we're not making systemic changes.
That was great. I mean, truly, I appreciate all of your thoughts and perspectives on that question of, you know, how do we continue with energy to move things forward in an environment that's not always friendly to our topic of conversation when we're in that space of talking about DEI. And I'm sure some of you have seen the recent article that came out from Texas, where the governor has made some very bold, I'll say bold statements about the value of equity and efforts to bring greater diversity to the workplace for state employees. And so we know that while Texas doesn't lead the way in this space at all, it certainly is a demonstration of just the broad disparity, right, and polarization within our society on this particular topic. So certainly commend all of you, all five of you, for continuing, or four of you, I'm sorry, for continuing your efforts in this space. But next, I think we're going to turn it over to taking some questions from the audience. And so, Jesse, I'll let you lead that part of the discussion.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I was just going to point out too that I thought it was very interesting that all of you talked about leading with a word starting with E, right? But it was all a little bit different. So Terry started us off with, okay, look at the economics, look at the business side and the measurable impacts. Whereas, Nicole, you talked a lot more about the empathy. And then Marcia, you expanded on equity. And so I think it's really interesting how you're kind of not necessarily leading with the D part of DEI, but you're leading with the other things that eventually lead to something more diverse and inclusive. So I just wanted to point that out, just to draw that connection for folks here. And yes, I would like to open it up to anyone on the call that does have a question, because we do have about 20 more minutes left of our presentation today. And I want to make sure that if anyone does have a question, they can answer it. And I am looking through the chat. I don't see anything as of yet. I thought I saw a question, but I see Abdullah, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi everybody. Thank you. This is Abdullah. I am MnDOT's Transportation Equity Coordinator. I really appreciate the insights. This is wonderful insights that you shared. What I wonder and where my question comes in is, there's a balance between trying to make sure we don't close off the conversation from folks that are still hesitant or don't realize or appreciate the importance of this work, while at the same time on the other side, there are communities that have historically been neglected, underserved, burdened, and harmed. So it looks to me some type of false equivalence, right? There are folks that really are not even on the table, right? And this is trying to sort of like rebalance things and to make sure folks get the most out of the system, or at least equitable fair share from the system. So how do you balance those two sides of that coin?
I think from Caltrans, I'm going to go back to the data because that's been our largest kind of challenge, especially around maintenance, maintaining the system, where we're expanding, where we're not expanding. And it's constantly showing the data because people are like, oh, we have no information. We don't know how to do this. And I feel like if people are continuing to ask those questions or not understanding, and especially folks that maybe have a more technical brain and are not like really thinking, that DE&I is something to be part of their work, or that, again, that's your job. You're an equity person. I'm an engineer, right? It's really highlighting the data. And I think from California's perspective, we had a governor that ran on health and all policies. And so I would really kind of push that narrative of what are we doing in the state? We're kind of looking at how people want to thrive as a community. Even if you remove race, your income, your gender identity, people really just want to be healthy. What does that mean for people? How do we kind of center healthy communities across the state? And then when you think about that, people are like, oh yeah, I definitely want to be healthy, or oh yeah, I would love to walk my child to a park, right? And so I ask those questions and push those questions, and then I bring it back to the data. We have CalEnviroScreen that kind of has layered about 26 different indicators to talk about where things are, where the most, I would say, health disparities are, and then where those populations are, and then what is that industry that is maybe perpetuating those spaces. And so that has helped, I think, bridge some of that gap when people are saying that's not my job, or I don't feel like I need to do this work. That is really kind of bringing it back. And then sometimes it's in a touche moment where people are like, oh, engineers aren't taught to do this. And I go, okay, well, you are, because there's bias in how we are learning these fields to actually really not think about the communities that you're creating in, right? You're being told to only go off of a particular model. And so when you start opening up what is there, right? People are like having aha moments. And then again, that data is very pivotal because when you start to see the stark differences, especially as racialized populations are more impacted, people start really kind of getting in their fields and maybe starting to explain away. But then you're like, you said the data would help us, right? Why are you trying to devalue that data now? And so it's great to have where we're at in equity space, because there are more data sets that are available to people. And I think using that data has helped bridge a lot of folks that were really just not wanting to cross that line of engaging in this work. I've seen great allyship with folks that were really naysayers in the beginning, and then have like this, like, oh my gosh, I now understand. Or when I just pose a simple question like, would you want to expand the freeway in your home community? What does that look like for you if you were to lose, 40, feet because they're taking over your space? How would you feel about that? Basic questions where people weren't even not even thinking about. And to me, I was like, these are basic things, but it maybe need to brought back in a simplistic way so that people can kind of get in that space.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I really appreciate that answer, and I want to touch on a question that was asked, I think, earlier. And Amar, I think you could even answer this too as it relates. But you were talking a little bit about, I think, displacement maybe at some point in our discussion. And so the question was, can we recreate the vibrancy of the neighborhoods lost to eminent domain? And I think, Amar, you could answer that, but I think anyone else could also chime in on that too.
I like to be hopeful and believe that, yeah, we absolutely can, right? It is truly, I believe a lot of it stems from ensuring that we have community voice, because oftentimes an organization is trying to make the decision and say, yes, this is the right thing. This is the best thing to be able to increase and do. Well, are we sure about that, right? Like, have we even received community perspectives? So my very optimistic brain in the future that I see, absolutely we can, but it's not something that just one chief equity officer in an agency can do alone. It's not even, I think it's the work of many. It's the work of both private and public sector coming together to recognize those opportunities, right? So we can tap into increasing and supporting the health equity, economic equity, like all of those parts and pieces. I wish I could take credit for this, but it comes from Keith Benjamin with FHWA. He says, transportation is the common denominator that builds communities. Mind blown. I'm like, that's absolutely true. And so as DOTs, the work we do, yes, absolutely important. We help set the precedence of what transportation looks like, but it is so important that we ensure meaningful and intentional relationships with and partnerships with other agencies in your state, with private companies, to ensure we're working, collaborating together. That's one of the things that I'm really trying to help teach and focus on here in Colorado. Coming into this branch after my first 90 days, I created the vision called Equity 360. Most of my career has been in the private side. I'm an infant in the public sector, only been in it 3 years. But what I see is so many silos, like even within the agency. And I'm just like, what are these walls? Like, I'm trying to break these walls all the time, because I need people to understand that the work that an engineer does or a planner does directly correlates to what my construction team is doing, which directly correlates to how we do contracting, right? Everything directly correlates, and we have to break these silos down, most especially internally, if we truly want to serve the greater good, right? And so Equity 360 is the vision that our branch has that says, in all the work we do as we build these equity lenses and these processes, understand that there's a holistic process and holistic healing that has to happen if we truly want to serve, right? So that would be my answer. Yes, absolutely. It's nothing we can do overnight. I wish we could, right? And I think it was you, Amar, who said it, something you said earlier, about protecting those who are in this space. And I fully agree, because this is probably one of the hardest jobs I've ever had here at the DOT, but I'm very passionate about it. And for those who are not in these roles, but you may be allies, I thank all of you, but I would encourage you to become accomplices. It's an accomplice who really, truly helps make the difference, right? The ally can take note and notice things and voice an opinion and share the support, but an accomplice you're willing to roll up your sleeves and make things happen. And that's what we really need more in these spaces. And that really is, I say that to our non-minorities who are in this space and say they want to do the work. Well, are you willing to roll up the sleeves? And then another piece, I here in Colorado, I don't know, I cause a lot of trouble here in Colorado, but that's okay. I get paid to cause trouble. But, you know, in Colorado, you know, I get a lot of folks who want to see everything be equitable right now and be fixed and done. And what I've been doing is I've been very transparent and pushing back and saying, you know, although it wasn't that long ago, even though there's a perception that it was done so long ago, or civil rights was done so long ago, it wasn't. And it was done intentionally. And in order to heal, we have to be intentional. And that work cannot be rushed, because then we will not have and be in the place that we want, where we do have, you know, a place where we're revived in our communities again. So don't be afraid to push back on the realities, because in not pushing back, that's creating more harm to us who are advocating and having that voice to say, these are the directions that we need to do. So I don't know if I said anything helpful, but yeah.
No, Marshall, that was so eloquent. The one little piece that I would add, and I saw it in the chat just now. Someone had commented that it's a lost generation. And so that's also the reality that I throw back to people here in Michigan when I'm asked the question of, can we create or recreate what was lost in Black Bottom or Paradise Valley, which is an area right outside of Detroit? And my answer is no, we cannot. What we can do is bring everything that we have to bear and all of the stakeholders that we need to have now around the table to have a different, more inclusive conversation now to create newly vibrant spaces that people have had the opportunity to define as their own, become a part of, and to engage with equitably. And Gloria just had her hand up, Gloria Jeff on the call. And to the extent that that is a problematic perspective, I'm going to blame Gloria for it, because of one of the questions that she asked me early on when I first came to MnDOT about an area of Detroit that has since been redeveloped. She asked me the question about, yeah, but are the people that live there now the same ones who did when the harm was caused? And in many cases, the answer is no. And you have to be very watchful. I was just on a planning call the other day with a team of stakeholders who want to do a project, and they're sure that they're talking equity and they're talking regentrification. And so that's my pushback of, we can, in fact, rebuild newly vibrant spaces that are equitably and inclusively formed and configured, planned, designed, all of that. But we can't get back or just undo, like with a magic wand, the harm that we've caused. We've got to very deliberately do things differently than we did in the past.
I would also say, like, I don't know if it's a lost generation, but there's like generational harm in these spaces, right, that we carry. So as people are displaced, you carry that as a people. And so I think when you people are saying, can we recreate it? I don't think we should recreate it. I think people, especially African Americans, have been creative and resilient for so long. We've seen new spaces come out. We've seen creativity come out of that displacement because of survival, right? But I think, again, when we're in these spaces of DE&I, like, what does it actually look like to allow, I'm going to say predominantly Black women, to rest and to have space to create what they want to create. I think that influences and changes the trajectory of all of our lives spanning the globe when you allow that creativity to kind of not just be hindered by boxes or communities, but you're allowing folks to do that naturally. And we're not saying we're going to go build it or we're going to go create it because we're investing in there. We're allowing folks to create their own spaces, whether that's, you know, a monolith or not. I do think it is our right as public entities to really think critically about what reparations means. What does land back mean? And how do we get there? Because I think there are dues that really need to be paid out. And it's, from my perspective, we don't need to be putting parameters on what those payouts look like for people that have been harmed. We should allow people to kind of create their own spaces with that payback, with that reparation. So that, again, we're not creating, you know, these limitations on that creativity. You know, we're allowing people to flourish in their spaces, and it could be, you know, yeah, new communities that are popping up or thriving communities that are already there. Just, you know, now people have the ability to kind of do what they want to do and they're not limited. But I think that also comes back to how we grapple with the relinquishment of dollars in land to people that have been really othered and really kind of told to keep their mouths shut. And so that's something that we're still grappling with, and I think we'll continue to grapple with it if we're not being honest. But I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. And I know we have got probably about 4 minutes left really to discuss anything more. There was one more question I think we can maybe cover briefly in the chat, which is, how is your workforce, or has your workforce increased with employing people of color in different levels of your organization? So I think that question really is rooted in not necessarily employing people just on like maybe a baseline or entry level, but at all levels. So has the number of people of color increased in your organizations?
I can answer that. I would say no right now, right? But we are at the cusp of beginning that, right? We're developing, you know, I'm working very closely with our HR team. I'm personally not right now interested in focusing a lot of my energy on how we, you know, just hire new diverse candidates within the organization. I'm actually more interested right now on how we ensure that for positions that we currently have within our organization, looking at promotional and professional development opportunities to build the staff that we have. Because, you know, there's a lot of talent. Like, I don't think I've been in an organization with so many smart people. I mean, like I'm blown away by the number of people who have so many letters behind their name. You know, it's amazing. And so why are we not tapping into the talent that we currently have? Because the talent that we currently have, which is not diverse, it's not as diverse as I think it can be, but there are individuals and there is opportunity. And so I'm focused in the moment building a process, helping support our team in HR, what that looks like to get them in management and higher up. Because it can be very lonely at the top, you know, it's very lonely at the top. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be as diverse, or it shouldn't be diverse. I should have other coworkers that look like me, and there aren't. That has been my entire career, though, starting off in construction, literally as an engineer, as a field engineer, pouring concrete. I've seen it all. I've walked the whole gamut. And even in those positions, I've always been the only or one of a handful that remotely looked like me and my family. So that's where I'm focused in. Our numbers are not there right now. But, you know, in this role, very passionate about it. And I have others who are as well. And we're looking to fix that. In the cradle to career that we're doing here in Colorado, it's building the pool so we can have more opportunity to say, because, and I also agree, people say that there's not enough talent out there. I fully disagree with that. There is talent. My question is how are you looking for? What are you doing? What are your resources in your networks? Because I imagine they might not be as diverse, and that needs to change too.
That is so true, Marcia, and we're trying to do the same at PennDOT. The numbers are not where I'd like for them to be, but we have a lot of support internally, especially from our leadership team, that we are now having conversations around being intentional about how we recruit and really expanding our network as well. But one thing that I'm really passionate about is really the retention part of it, because I think at least when I first started, I know there was a great push, got to be more diverse, we've got to hire more diverse candidates, and I am an advocate for that. I think that's very important. But it's when we get here, what do we have? What does our infrastructure look like internally to be able to support a more diverse workforce? Because you can hire as many diverse candidates as you like, but then are they going to leave within the first 3 or 6 months? And why are they leaving? So I think it's important to have a balance of both the recruiting and those programs that you mentioned, Marcia, to help sustain that. Mentoring, leadership development. I just think that's important. And sometimes I think we gloss over the inclusion piece of it because we're trying so hard to work on the hiring aspect of it, but there really needs to be a good balance of both.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And unfortunately, we are at time, and so we do have to end our discussion, although I'm sure we can talk about this for probably another hour. I just want to, first of all, thank all of you for attending today and speaking and sharing all your insights. If you look at some of the comments in the chat, I think a lot of people really responded well to what you had to say. So I really appreciate it. I do want to thank of course, Deputy Commissioner Collins for helping co-facilitate this discussion, as well as Gina Kunden and Frida Alvarez for their support from our Office of Equity and Diversity. And finally, Gloria Jeff, who essentially assembled all of you and contacted you and really made this happen. And so with that, I'm going to bring our discussion to a close, but I'll give Deputy Commissioner Collins, if you'd like to say anything more before we close, then feel free to jump in. So
I'll just say very quickly, absolutely fabulous panel to kick off our observation of Black History Month. Great conversation. I think that we couldn't have done a better job. So absolutely appreciate your efforts, Gloria, to tap in on a good group that was going to bring some really good energy to this conversation topic. And it's one that's so important. I know that we emphasize Black History Month during the month of February, and that's when we're really talking about so many of these topics that touch us and that, as this group demonstrates, we're passionate about. But these are really ongoing conversations for us, right? They don't start and stop within the 28 or 29 days of February. So just really appreciate this group being highlighting your perspectives and thoughts on the subject matter. Fabulous job. Can't say anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, right? Kim, thank you very much for your support. I just want to say selfishly, thank you, Gloria. I met you at Charleston at an AASHTO conference, and you just like took me under your wings. So thank you. You're amazing, and I really appreciate you and everyone who's on the call. I mean, everyone on the call is clearly an ally. Push a little bit further to be an accomplice, but I've heard some amazing things about your guys' department, and I look forward to collaborating with some of the stuff that you guys are doing, and I'm happy to share some of the work that we're doing here in Colorado as well.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. And Gloria, I think Gloria has adopted all of us. She truly is. And I hope that you don't get offended by this, Gloria, but I look at Gloria as, from Soul Food, Big Mama, because she feeds our souls. Mm-hmm. On so many levels, personally, professionally, and she's just so giving. And I don't think you realize the magnitude of the effect, the impact that you have on all of us equiteers. So thank you, Gloria, and thank you for all of you for allowing me to share in this moment. This was great.
In terms of full disclosure, to that point, one of the questions that was out there originally was one about essentially what African American person has influenced you most in transportation. And it was meant to be this historical question. And it's like, oh, no. The living history, the living influence of Gloria Jeff is what pushes me along every day. MnDOT, many of you may or may not know, and I hope I'm not outing you too much, Gloria, but Gloria used to be the director of the Michigan Department of Transportation at a different point in her career. And so many people that I work with to this day still reflect upon and cite Gloria's influence on their work. So the state of Michigan is still being heavily influenced by all that you have contributed to the field, and we appreciate you so very much.
I would agree. That question came up, I was like, duh. I mean, the person that's even asking this question, I think has provided a lot of agency, even if you knew it or not, for folks in this field to continue to be very critical about the spaces that we want to take up and should be taking up. And then again, just the criticalness of being a non-planner engineer, planner engineer, to kind of challenge these structures that we operate in. And I think Marcia said it, to break down these silos, like, so that we can just be, people in these spaces creating the change. Gloria, you're just, inspirational as a living person in this field and just in general life.
Great.
Thank you all. I am humbled by your acknowledgement, and I'm going to leave it at that. Jesse, I know we're running long, but I look forward to continuing to work with all of you because you are doing amazing work.
Thank you. And thank you, Jesse. Thank you.
Yes, thank you,
Yes.
Jesse.
Yeah, thank you,
Oh,
Jesse.
absolutely.
Don.
Yeah.
Everyone have a
great meeting all of
wonderful
you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take
Bye
care.
now.
Take care. Bye-bye.